Kim Borg is, of course, a research fellow at BehaviourWorks Australia.
Yes, I'm also a self-proclaimed nerd and media fanatic, which is where the topic of today came from.
We do have a question to ask you, which is, do you mind if we smoke? 40 years ago, we could have lit up and it would have been accepted, there would have been smoke in the room, but these days, if someone actually did light a cigarette, it would be seen as socially quite shocking.
So I loved Grease when I was a kid. I watched it many, many times. The message that came across really clearly was that if I was a dorky girl and I wanted to be cool and get the guy, I had to don some leather and start smoking. So where did the link between media, smoking and psychology start?
Sigmund Freud, the father of psychology, Chuckles as he was known. So Freud was responsible for one of the biggest thinking changes in Western society. Our daily actions are actually the result of unconscious drives and desires and dangerous sexual undercurrents. His work was turbocharged by this man, his nephew,
Edward Bernais, who brought Sigmund Freud's ideas to the Americas. So he read his uncle's work. And he was actually the first person to come up with the term public relations, because the term propaganda wasn't cool anymore. In the early 1920s, it was not socially appropriate for women to smoke and for women to smoke in public, which for the American Tobacco Association was a problem because they were missing out on 50% of their market. So they engaged Bernais to try and encourage women to smoke. What he found is that cigarettes were symbolic of something to women, symbolic of something that men had that they didn't have. I am, of course, talking about power, but Bernais did realise that he could tap into this unconscious desire and link cigarettes to freedom and democracy and power.
This made world news. These are not cigarettes, these are torches of freedom.
Smoking in movies is associated with being cool, being the rebel, being the bad guy, but really it's had a bit of a messy history. So between the 1950s and the 1990s, evidence started coming out that if teenagers saw people smoking in movies and on TV, they were more likely to start smoking themselves. But you can't sell cigarettes to kids anymore, right?
How many levels of wrong can we see?
There's a range of behaviours that the media has shown influence either on individuals or at a society level. After that came out, not only did beach tourism plummet because people were afraid to go in the water, but the culling and hunting of sharks increased exponentially. Sharks were bad, sharks were demonised. The media isn't just trying to sell us things. In fact, sometimes it's influencing us in ways that aren't great and aren't necessarily on purpose. A meta-analysis was conducted, which is basically a big analysis of a bunch of other studies that have been done, looking at the influence of viewing violent media content on adults as well as children. And what they found was that with adults, it did have effects, but they were generally short-term. With the children, however, the effects tended to be more longer-term. And this is due to a theoretical concept called observational learning. What Bandura did was he conducted an experiment with a bunch of children who watched adult models behaving differently towards Bobo. But what they found was that those children who saw the adult model behaving aggressively then went into another room to play with their toys, and they played with the more aggressive toys. It's essentially the unwritten rules for how we believe as a society we're meant to behave. Some examples of how social norms have been displayed and changed in TV include Will and Grace, which was the first commercial TV series that had a lead homosexual male who was not a stereotype.
In America's case, Harvard University decided they would change social norms, and the way they did this was to ask screenwriters in the film and TV industries to talk about designated drivers. In other words, if there was a group of characters going out, one of them wouldn't drink in order to get the others home safely. There was a 24% decrease in road fatalities, and they attribute this partly to the norming of the designated driver idea.
The TAC's campaigns have now essentially become a part of the Victorian community and have over time shifted our attitudes and our behaviours on the road to make us safer drivers. These guys tapped into emotions, much like Freud did, but in a very different way. Essentially, documentaries on these big issues that face society can also be quite successful in changing our behaviour, at least in the short term.
So, how have things changed? We started with smoking, let's go back.
So, Sandy was how smoking used to be portrayed. It was cool, it was sexy, so was she. If Sandy's continued to smoke, she's probably now looking a bit more like Terry, who is the more common way that we see smoking portrayed in the media nowadays. The media can change our behaviour, whether we like it or not. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It can be used to create a good, positive social change. But that's not to say that we can't change it back.